And hello. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first episode of the Creative Path Show. And what I want to discuss with you today is the history of coaching. And this is important for me because I decided to take on that moniker for myself in my business today. And I have had coaching clients, and I am currently coaching clients. And it's something that fell into my lap. So I decided, why not? And when I mean fell into my lap, I mean don't have a certification, and I'm not afraid to say that. And I believe that my experiences combined with my curiosity have enabled me to be in a very fortunate position to assist others through what is called coaching in the practitioner sense. But as we're going to uncover in this show, I want to share that it's more of a verb instead of a noun. The act of coaching is a little bit more important, and we're going to find out why. So I'll start with a bit more about my story. And I rediscovered coaching as a business this year. And the last time I got a relevant certification in this space was for fitness, specifically CrossFit, getting this L1 certificate back in 2013. And I enjoyed that. I was in my young, early 20s, aiding individuals who were age late 20s to and 50s, helping them develop themselves physically, and was writing programs for them based on counting macros. And I had a bigger hunger to be involved in software and tech. So I left that a year in. So back to where I am at today, this notion of coaching is young. This is a young notion in terms of the history of humanity. The first book, the seminal book that came out about business coaching, which is bleeds into life coaching, as us entrepreneurs know that a lot of business is life, and business is itself a very meaningful activity for the entrepreneur. This book called the it's called Coaching for Performance. That came out in 1990. So that's just 3 decades ago. And what I'm going to do is talk about that book, how it relates with industrialist education, online learning platforms, and whatever topics that come. So what do I mean by industrialist education? Let's start with what I don't mean. I'm not talking about an education that was training students to be skilled at factory jobs. As in 1915, this was a subject of debate, but as we saw, it never happened. And I'm not accusing the Carnegies and Rockefellers of masterminding a system that would funnel lower school children into their factories, because as I read in John Taylor Gatto's book, The Underground History of American Education, he's, and I quote, all became in time submerged in the system they did so much to create, almost helpless to slow its momentum, even had they so desired. I'll double click on there by saying I've recently been exposed to these notions that the Rockefellers and the General Board of Education were in a conspiracy to funnel these kids so they could have a nation not of thinkers but of simply doers, lower consciousness people serving these. And I'm holding that space for that thought nonetheless, but we're gonna move on. What I want to mean is this: that when I say the industrialist in industrialist education, I'm referring to the economic era from the 18th to the mid 20th century, when industrial work resulted in living in a middle class. The average American could work literally for 40 plus years. They'll get taken care of with pensions and social security. In my experience, we don't have that anymore. We don't have that luxury of working somewhere for so long. And talking about education, I have a vision about the future of education and learning in academia and in the workplace. And I want to see people learn by themselves and use that so they can get ahead and solve genuine problems, instead of with academia with its 4-year phase of learning. And those 4 years, things have now been drastically shifting. The window for 4 years, if we look at the rapidity of AI and its movement, that is just too much time. And so I want to assist people as a coach and help other coaches emerge to collapse that timeline and focus specifically on just a few key areas of the student, of the learner. And also in the workplace, I'd like to have the vision of managers, teachers, and religious leaders and political leaders to utilize coaching more to help increase the awareness and responsibility of the coachee. And now this is a subject that is mentioned in Sir John Whitmore's Coaching for Performance. Okay. Well, this show is about connecting a lot of dots, as creativity to me is about making connections. So I will be jumping around between these themes: the theme of coaching versus teaching versus education, the history of coaching, the misconceptions around coaching, the connection between coaching, psychology, and human potential. And a majority of my research for the show draws from that book I just mentioned, Coaching for Performance. Sir John Whitmore had already been successfully coaching business owners and employees and managers for 15 years. And he also used to race cars for sport. So he has experience of being a coachee. So I want to start here. The problem that I had, and that most of you, assuming, let's start there, that most of you have right now, and it's about getting told what to do. And I've developed a new understanding of being told what to do. I'm not saying I love being told what to do, but I understand there's different contexts where I am ready to get told what to do if I've reached a limit. But there's a chapter in this book that I want to talk about, chapter 18, and here's a quote. Most people have a long history of being told by parents, by school teachers, and by their first bosses. So naturally, they expect to be told and may find it strange being asked for their opinion. And another way of looking at the resistance to coaching is to consider what they are really resisting. It is, of course, becoming more aware or more responsible and the consequences of both. You can then coach people on recognizing the source of the resistance and on overcoming it. So I've been told as a kid what to do often. And I want to categorize the people who've been telling me what to do as teller, capital T-E-L-L-E-R, tellers. And so this tellers, if we look into the history of humanity, teller might have resorted to violence quite often, like bashing you on the head or having armed guards ready that would make you do what they want you to do. Luckily, these days, a lot of us are being told what to do with the carrot, right? I just mentioned this in the stick in the carrot phrase, stick in the carrot phrase. So the carrots today is money, and I'm evaluating my life and looking at who the tellers were. Parents, religious leaders, school teachers, and administrators, wage job managers. And one sorting out activity that I didn't do was understanding money. So even though I got the carrot of money, I didn't know what to do for myself, and I developed communication disorders and even jail time and shifting careers and quote unquote losing progress. And I'd say that was rooted in this phrase: good people wait for an expert to tell them what to do. I had expert waiting-itis. And that quote I just mentioned, good people wait for an expert to tell them what to do, that's from John Taylor Gatto. And I believe a lot of these disorders develop because I didn't take responsibility of doing what I want to do and then figuring out the consequences as at an early age, from, let's say, childhood up to the middle of college. And another part that I want to talk about of getting told what to do is that the context of when it's useful. And so what I've come to realize in the theory that I'm going to put forth is that when there is a sense of immense urgency or crisis, that is when it is vital to not spend too much time on questioning what needs to be done. And usually the expert is the authority in this case, someone that is easily discernible for their skills or qualities, that when you follow what they order you to do, that it's reasonable to do that. Okay, and so the literal example is a police officer when there's a crisis occurring and it's in a mall and there's an altercation going on. They tell you what to do, and then you follow that. Okay. Now, one way I want to stretch this analogy is talking about the urgency of that. Most of my activity in the last 7-8 years was based on a perceived urgency for myself, which I also notice in other people. The urgency of climbing the corporate ladder, or the urgency of traveling, or the urgency of buying the latest and greatest technology. Those three things: climbing the corporate ladder, traveling, and getting good experiences, quote unquote good experiences, and buying technology. That urgency puts you in a state where you'll listen to anybody just about anything. And I'm saying you. So for me, I had this urgency growing up because of the scarcity that's behind the urgency. So as a coach, I'm dedicated to recognizing fears, because if fears is that if you imagine a triangle, let's have 3 levels of it. At the bottom is fears. At the next level, in this case, is scarcity, which is a recognized fear. And then the topmost level is urgency. Because when things are scarce, right? This material item is not available, like money or a person in your life or friends. When these aren't available, there's going to be a sense of urgency. And all these words are descriptions of urgency: clinginess, stinginess, and anxiety. Because I felt pressed for time, I would cling onto relationships that weren't working out for me. I would be stingy with the time I would give to people who are actually going to develop me in the best way. Again, usually those are people who are coaches, because as you go back to the quote, let's look at the quote again, because we're going to talk about the resistance to increasing responsibility and increasing awareness. I'll read it again, and I quote: "Most people have a long history of being told by parents, by school teachers, and by their first bosses. So naturally, they expect to be told and may find it strange being asked for their opinion. And another way of looking at the resistance to coaching is to consider what they are really resisting. And it is, of course, becoming more aware or more responsible in the consequences of both." So some people in your life may feel like they're challenging you on an egotistical level, but some of these people, when they ask questions, instead of telling you what to do, and they stretch your imagination, they stretch your thinking, they're attempting to help you increase your responsibility so you can stop waiting for the experts. So that's what happened to me when I stopped waiting for the experts. One way I can describe this is when I joined a network marketing effort during college. I dropped out of college to pursue this network marketing effort. And that happened for me. And I admire who I was then. And I was first introduced into self-development and masterminds as every morning at around 7:30. I'm stretching my memory here, but I do remember clearly every morning at 7:30 I would go to my upline's home, and we would spend 20 to 30 minutes watching some motivational video. It was like Tony Robbins. It was watching The Secret. And then we'd feel this electricity amongst ourselves, as we prepared ourselves to develop our businesses. And I realized at that time I was increasing those increased my awareness. Difficult to say if my responsibility increased, but my awareness increased. And then I remember purchasing. I left that. I left that business within a year. I remember making like a check for like less than $20. Fucking $20 for hours and hours of of conferences and enrolling people and building a team. And I looked at this check and I said, I have had enough. So what I'll say is that after I left that, though, Tony Robbins made an impression on me. Tony Robbins was someone who kept increasing my awareness. He was introducing me to ideas about breath work and going on morning walks. So that was technically a kind of a coach. And actually, while we're here, because I want to address this now, it's about when you read something in a book, which is advice, because coaching doesn't happen when you read an author in a book versus a coach, who to me is and I'm going to use a definition of coaching for performance, where a coach's job is to create a container for the coachee to increase their awareness, increase their responsibility. So on the one hand, books are a one-way transmission asset, one-way information asset. So what I want to refine, a location in my life, and what I mean is sitting down to read a book. I am myself opening up a container to increase my awareness, because usually we don't think about increasing our responsibility when we pick up some piece of information. It's usually about, am I going to increase my awareness about the subject that the book is about? And so usually it's a yes, but you and I have experienced where we read a book and we just don't get it. And usually that's because there's other things in our mind that are cluttering up our attempts to understand what's really going on in the book. And when people say, I'm just not a book reader, it's not that they're not a book reader. Why? The same cognitive capacities for reading a book are the same as watching a movie, watching Instagram reels, YouTube videos. You're reading closed captions. So that same cognitive capacity is happening. It's just a lot of the entertainment that's available on social media is easily able to access other areas of the brain that want to produce these feel good emotions. And so when one sits down for a book, and I sit down for a book, I'm actively understanding that I'm just reading text. I'm not witnessing moving pictures. I'm not witnessing sounds. I'm not witnessing these other things that are usually meant to enhance an experience. Words on a text and focusing on those words, that is going to, over time, help me refine what's going on for me. Plus, let's talk about, okay, I'm going to make sure we capture this. Let's capture this area of what's in my mind and responses. So back to when someone says I'm not a book reader, when they're receiving this one-way transmission, when they are getting a book that is a container for receiving advice from an expert, and some people, when they read a book, might already within harbor a pretension that they're just going to get told what to do again, and they don't want to do it. Right? That is unfortunate, as I know that we associate textbooks with the teacher that just tells you what to do, with the teacher that might have said, can you read better? Do you know how to read well? Some teachers usually will attempt to help you improve your reading, but maybe your classmates or your peers notice that you fucking sucked at reading, and then you harbor this within yourself. So it makes sense that as you want to study something, to enroll a person who can help you gain the courage, regain the courage, and arrive at a net level of neutrality as far as reading is concerned. I'm not going to say you're going to love reading, but just have the courage to say, I can read this because I'm committed to something greater. And we're going to talk about how courage is related to commitment. But right now, we just dove into what is preoccupying the mind. I said something similar to that word, but what preoccupies the mind before one reads a book, when they would tell themselves that they're just not a good reader. Another part of it is the responses to reading a book, because if I could share that reading a book isn't just about reading, it's about the reactions. I think that's like the biggest takeaway right now in the last 20 or so minutes that I've been chatting with you, because writing down the responses and the reactions that one has to a piece of text in a paragraph, that is the self recognizing after it reads a complete thought of someone else's brain, because books are in a sense an extension of the author's brain. So we just witness a thought from the author's brain about a subject, and then we're going to make a thought to their thought. And people usually keep thoughts to themselves, and I do that too, especially if I'm reading on a bench in a park somewhere. I usually don't do that now. I make an effort to read at home with pen and paper in hand, or with my document system, such that I can write almost every single response I have to a passage. Because sometimes in these responses and reactions that you have when you're reading a book, they won't always be positive. Sometimes they'll be negative. And so there's two sides of reading. And so that also might contribute to someone not wanting to read because of the negative thoughts that occur. Oh, I just read this passage about self-improvement. I should be doing this. Now I'm discussing it with myself. I want to stop reading. Definitely a negative thought that could happen. And then you just put down the book, and then they pick up the phone. And you know how that goes. So what I suggest for the person who struggles and has negative thoughts that arise is to create a container. So this is actually self-coaching. Okay, a book that any book, actually, it can be even nonfiction, because these are thoughts from a person that has been recorded into a piece of paper. And a self-coaching environment can occur where one creates a space for that book to be read and for their own thoughts to be recorded and to examine those thoughts. And I think it's time to move on from here. So that sums up the books and advice. So they could be purely taken for advice, but instead let's reframe what a book can be as an opportunity for self-coaching. So I will say that that's been an activity that's been done likely as long as books have been coming out, ever since the Gutenberg, where people received books and they wanted to learn more about a subject, and then they would write their notes. That's what I just summarized. Now, what's interesting is what's coming to my mind is the glossolalia. Glossolalia, yeah, that's a word for the monks who would transcribe the Bible, and they would write their own notes, or they would draw interesting doodles like dragons on the edges of the scripts. And I remember this when I was reading Umberto Eco's Name of the Rose, which is an amazing murder mystery novel. So back to these definitions that I want to share with you. I have behind me the Barnhart Concise Dictionary of Etymology. And let's look at the definition of coach. In 1566, this is borrowed from the Middle French word coche. Now, I'm going to chop these words up, so please excuse me or write to me as to the correct pronunciations of these words. From the earlier German Koche, and from Hungarian Kochi, I believe. Koch. And that is a town in northern Hungary where such carriages were made. So we're talking about carriages made in Hungary. Now, next, I quote, "The sense of a private tutor is first recorded in 1848 in British university usage, and that of an athletic trainer in 1861. So what we are going to posit here is that inside of a carriage, there would be a person telling a student tips and tricks and trades. Also, coach as a verb, coming out in 1849, is to tutor or to train. So now that makes me want to know, what is the etymology of the word train? Noun. Before 1338, train. I quote, "A drawing out. Delay." I'll repeat that. A drawing out. delay. So right there, I wanted to share that when we think about training, let's say training with strength training, lifting weights, we are drawing out ourselves, our muscles. We're drawing out our muscles over time. The awareness of a system, because we have systems for strength training, and there's a delay. There's a delay in the time between lifts, and then there's a delay of days before you see the gains. So keep that in mind. Train later on became defined as trailing part, retinue, or procession. And so when we think about train and training, let's think about it of like the history and go back to the fitness and strength training. Those weeks trailing each other, and there's that procession. The procession result of frequent training had to start with that first part of the procession. A train isn't made in this sense of one car, it's two, and then the two needed the one, and then the three still needed the first one. Okay, I'll move on. And so the sense of a connected line of railroad cars or wagons moving together is first recorded before 1824. And then train as a verb in the sense of instruction and discipline and teaching, that is recorded much later in 1542 and probably developed from the meaning of draw by persuasion to induce, 1526, and to manipulate in order to bring to a desired form, about 1440. So when I think of to instruct, I think of children, and it could be thinking of a series of lessons. That is a train in itself. So we think of curriculum as a series of lessons. Curriculum, it relies on the first part, on the procession, and then you move along and you move along. So that's the history and the etymology of the word train, downstream of the history and of the word coach. And again, coach was a private tutor. So before coaching became just about sports, before that it was actually about a private tutor who happened to coach an athlete. And I actually want to stay here in etymology land with you. So let's talk about what it means to educate. To educate as a verb. 1447, it means to bring up children, to train them. It's borrowed from Latin. I'll chop this up, but educatus, as participle of educare, to bring up, rear, educate, related to educere, bring out. So the word is out, plus ducere means to lead. And that interests me because education is then about leadership. It's about leadership. And my friends, I do not admire 80% of school teachers who are leading our children. I haven't met many school teachers who love themselves. I'm going to be frank about that. But that originally was what it meant. And we think of old educators, ancient education. I'm talking when Alexander was mentored by a famous Greek philosopher. That is to me an ancient classic and successful definition of how education occurred, because this private tutor showed this gentleman Alexander, that conqueror, but he wasn't just a conqueror, he was a strategist. So this guy was able to make a lot of connections, create a lot of creativity to conquer what he needed to conquer. So education also, as is recorded about schooling, that happened in the 16th century in 1588. And then the term educator didn't arrive until 1566. So that's what educate is, that sense of schooling for the young. And that's an old term, my friends. That's 500 years old. And the point of this show right now is for us to help differentiate between what an education is, given this classic term, versus what a coaching session is. Because coaching includes education, but it transcends it. Coaching includes education, but it transcends it. Because I've noticed for myself, I decided to coach because I have the experience. So, coaching isn't necessarily just about sharing experience, it could just be being present and raising awareness. And that was when we think of life coaches. And we can talk about that in a moment. But what's dichotomy right now that I'm creating for you, education versus coaching, because education is really meant as of now, let's say it's meant for children, people at a lower developmental stage, humans at a lower developmental stage, where this instruction is necessary. And there is a sense of urgency. There is a sense of urgency for a child by a certain point in their life to have some basic skills as far as literacy, as far as maths, as to skills that this overarching society that we have, this Western society, emphasizes that literacy and maths aren't something that are something to be learned later. Instead, it's something to be learned sooner. Whereas coaching, to me, it involves less urgency and more patience. And this is why, as we've seen, there are some coaching programs, activities, and people that are costly, that are expensive, because the coach is giving attention and giving patience to the coachee, and they're not making the situation urgent. Instead, what they do is remove the false sense of urgency, past all the thoughts that people would have about themselves that cover up the real problem, and then they identify the problem. But it does take patience, because the person is going to be squirming a bit as they try to figure out what is going on within themselves, and the coach is present for that. So they're not educating when that partition of coaching is happening. A coach is not educating when a question is being asked that is out of curiosity. There is no education that is happening on part of the coach. They're helping, rather, the coachee educate themselves. But I don't want to use that word so much anymore. And I actually want to move on past this dichotomy we created, down that you have the difference between education and coaching, because I want to talk about the word teach. So to teach, probably before the year 1200, that's 800 years ago, teachen, developed from Old English teachen, to show, to teach, for 899, from Proto-Germanic, relating to Old English, teachen, tachen, sign, mark, or token. Now that interests me. Teach, to me, is fundamentally more closer to coaching. So let's look at those words that we described. Sign, mark, like a mark on a tree, and token. I'm going to focus on sign and mark, because this reminds me of symbols. And we use symbols to remember things and symbols to remind us. We think of logos. Those are signs that are that taught us to associate a feeling with it. Let's think of Nike. The Nike sign taught me that they are the running brand. And Nike sign taught me that when I see it on other people who wear that logo, that I am in the tribe of people who wear Nike and they're doing well for themselves. So yeah, I am a person who uses Nike, and we can apply this to gun manufacturers, to cigarettes, to alcoholic drinks, to hats. Okay, the list goes on. But what is it about teaching? One more definition I found is that teacher, probably before 1300. Now, a teacher person who teaches, form from Middle English, and an earlier sense, that which shows or points out. Indicator, index finger. It's recorded about 1290. So I like to imagine a group of people hiking. Imagine you're hiking with somebody. No, I mean, you're hiking with a group. And let's go back to that age, the 13th century. And you're hiking with this group. And there's a person in front of the group, and then they extend their arm and they point to the left. And everybody in the group wasn't looking at the left. They were looking ahead, or you were chatting with someone, you're just gazing at them or at the road. But the person points, and all of you look and see where that goes to. And it's like a site of a battle. Or maybe that person pointed to a rock formation. And then they explain something about it because that person is your guide. That's the guide of the group. That to me is what I'm imagining the sense of teaching is. They point out something and they share the natural history or the importance of them, and then you receive this information, and it took them pointing it out to you. So I like this because that's what coaching to me is. Okay, because coaching is a new activity in this past century. It's not even a century old. It's not even half a century old officially. But let's think of coaching as a pointing out from both sides. The coachee arrives to the coach, and there's a problem that is within the coachee. And questions are that index finger where you both were talking about one area, talking about someone else, talking about your experience, yet the coach says index finger to this word, or I'm putting this index finger to what you mentioned before. And then that's when the coachee has an opportunity to redefine or re-explore that area of the conversation. And then they teach themselves through the pointing out that is occurring between the both of them. And sometimes what is getting pointed out is ugly. And then that the witness of another person present is enough for the coachee to feel the courage, because they made a commitment with the coach that they're going to be willing to look at what is being pointed at. Great. So that's a bit about teaching versus coaching versus educate as far as the etymology goes. Now, what about teaching today? I mentioned that I have a vision for people to teach themselves outside of the conventional education system, a system that is expensive as a child in terms of losing the amount of refinement of intelligence that can occur because of the constant rote memorization and the constant shuffling of studies. And constant shuffling of studies is spending an hour on one subject, a bell rings, and moving on to another subject. Then teaching the self, I want that to be focused on how much interest do I have on this activity, such that I want to study as long as I need to without any bell or timer. Then when the boredom arrives or when I want to do something else, I'm able to stop teaching myself, but remember what I taught myself. So like wind down periods included in teaching of the self. And when I look at the history of coaching and what coaches do, they emphasize at the end of their sessions or at the end of their programs a recap that is given to the student so they can affirm for themselves, what have I learned? Because self-assessment is an incredibly important part of coaching. And so I'm going to dive back into the book again. So we're going to look at a part of the book where we're going to talk about the difference between descriptive terminology rather than evaluative terminology. When we use this terminology that is evaluative, and I'm going to share this, we use it often for ourselves, and it can lead to emotional bursts. So, and I quote, the coach should use, and as far as possible, encourage the coaches to use descriptive terminology rather than evaluative terminology. This helps to maintain detachment and objectivity and reduces the counterproductive self-criticism that distorts perception. And there's a diagram. Imagine a triangle, isosceles triangle, with the point to the right side of the page. Okay, so it's not a right side up triangle; it's pointing to the right, and there's a line in the middle of it. And on the left side, on the inside of the triangle, you're going to see words like good, right, success, and fuzzy. That's a fuzzy generalization. And then on the bottom left of this inner part of the triangle, failure, wrong, and bad. So, good, right, success, failure, wrong, bad. These are fuzzy generalizations. And notice how bad and good are mentioned here. So is right and wrong. These moral terms are so broad, yet they can invigorate fear within, because when we are children, there is a sense of urgency when we receive instruction from a lot of quote unquote teachers, that all they say it's that you're wrong, and they say you're wrong, and that's it. And so I can feel this tense moment. I don't feel tense now, but I remember just feeling that when someone told me that. I have a sense of urgency that if I ever thought about it again, I don't want to think about it again, because my expert, let's call him teller expert, that teacher, that teller, didn't explain to me. I didn't learn anything new. I associated bad. Bad means I cover it up. Whatever that event or activity that I did that I call bad or wrong or good or right. When we say things that are right, we're also hurting our own development, especially when we're communicating with other people, because the sense of right it requires so much more discussion. And so let's go back to the triangle. Okay. So these words are on the left side of the inner part of the triangle. As we move to the right part of the triangle, we move from fuzzy generalizations to detailed and specific. So that's a descriptive axis, detailed and specific. Whereas on the left side, it was judgmental. So that to me is what coaches are meant to do. And this is what friends usually do for each other. When we have the patience to move beyond saying what is right and what is wrong, and say, what did you do? When did you do it? How did you feel? And who were you with? What did they feel? Those kinds of questions that are detailed and specific. So what's up with this next subject that I want to talk about, which is a coach practitioner and a leader or a manager who coaches? So this is something that I struggled with, because earlier this year, I didn't think I'd be a coach. Earlier this year, what I wanted to do was create a course that I could sell. And I'm going to talk about this later, but courses aren't as easy as you think they should be, because they require experience with one-on-one time of teaching that subject material that would be in the course to an actual human and seeing the results of teaching that. And so I came to realize that it is my job to create a curriculum or a program that might work, but I wouldn't make a digital product for that yet until I had people where I help them. And I didn't want to call myself a tutor. I didn't want to call myself even a teacher, but coach comes up because I want that person who has a problem that they purchased my product for, that I'm going to assist them. So I was hesitant to call myself something like a life coach or a business coach. And so what's up with the stigma? Again, what's up with the stigma? Well, we'd think that if someone really had a fucked up life, they might need a coach or a therapist. And I'm not knocking therapists, but there's just that stigma again. Outsourcing my problems to someone else. That seems unreasonable. But it is that very reason of not wanting to work with somebody that holds a lot of people back. And so the way I got over it was just to realize that I want to be part of the new wave of education. And coach is a good way to differentiate myself from teacher, because teacher is actually, in the Western world, one of the worst ways to describe oneself as of now. One of my favorite authors, Seth Godin, describes himself as a teacher, but maybe in his circles that is still accepted. But to me, it doesn't make sense to describe myself as a teacher. And coach has the sports connotation and association that it's funny, because I don't want to be purely a competitive individual with others, but for within, do advocate to be better than who I was yesterday, and for my clients to be better than who they were yesterday. And want to share with you that a life coach or a business coach or a dating coach, or I found over 180 words or industries that could have coaches. And so I realized that makes a lot of sense, because each of these industries have skills and results and outcomes that a person couldn't do alone. And of course, each of these industries have managers. And then coaching as a verb, coaching as an activity, is something managers can do. Not all managers coach, by the way. And those are the managers who don't see the potential in you. And so this is a great time to talk about another piece of history of coaching, which is about human potential. And this is where things get really interesting for me. So Sir John Whitmore, how did he get involved in coaching? Well, he visited a place called the Esalen Institute, and he discovered the human potential movement at the Esalen Institute. And I quote, as Elizabeth Putzig writes in the Encyclopedia of Religions, the human potential movement, or HPM, originated in the 19th as a countercultural rebellion against mainstream psychology and organized religion. It is not itself a religion, new or otherwise, but a psychological philosophy and framework, including a set of values that have made it one of the most significant and influential forces in modern Western society. Who else was included in this movement? Abraham Maslow of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Aldous Huxley, the man who wrote Brave New World, and a few other names like a Mr. Alan Watts. And when Sir John Whitmore describes the coaching process, I read that he mentions transpersonal psychology as the basis for him to see the potential in people, and he uses coaching to help people reach their highest potential. And transpersonal psychology, I looked that up, and I looked at an article in 1984, which was written by Ken Wilber, who is someone that has influenced me in a very positive direction towards understanding worldviews. And Ken Wilber wrote in 1984, this was written about him, and I quote, and this is from the B Zone, and I quote, Ken is a leading transpersonal psychologist and editor-in-chief of Revision, an academic journal devoted to psychological and sociological impacts of consciousness research. This is where things get interesting, because before I decided to be a coach, I was curious about psychological development of humanity. And I love that this connection is being made right here, right now. Sir John Whitmore's coaching, the seminal book, Coaching for Performance, coming out in 1990, relating to the 60s, the human potential movement, where I believe some of the foremost thinkers about developmental psychology have arrived to our Earth. Transpersonal psychology also interests me based on what Ken Wilber wrote as well. And I quote him, to render spirituality theoretically acceptable to the other, or quote unquote lower schools of psychology, by presenting mental models that persuasively and comprehensively include the higher or spiritual stages of adaptation Transpersonal psychology forces schools, such as psychoanalysis, to reconsider the reductionistic dismissal of transcendental possibilities. And so Ken Wilber, Maslow, and Sir John Whitmore, and Alan Watts, these guys didn't dismiss the spirituality. And I read on in that same article that transpersonal psychology is like that inner, if it's a Venn diagram with spirituality is one circle and another circle psychology, transpersonal psychology is where that Venn diagram is, where those inner circles meet. The inner parts of those circles they have the same rigor and they have the same sobriety of the science, capital S science field, when they approach spirituality instead of dismissing it out of hand. And so that's important to me because, as I said, I believe when Sir John Whitmore refers transpersonal psychology as a way for him to understand human potential, that means to me that he understands the spirituality and part of this, the spirituality of purpose. So that Esalen Institute, again, that's what I want to mention. That institute had produced another person that I really enjoy listening to, is Alan Watts. And Alan Watts turned out to be the dean of the American Academy of Asian Studies, which was kind of a predecessor to the Institute, as the Institute was founded by Michael Murphy and Richard Price. So these people are connected, and they are connected to coaching, which coaching is about human potential, which is about encountering uncertainty, encountering emotional, distraught places on part of the coachee. Yet the coach is able to create a container for that coachee to discover more about themselves and perform better. And I love that the book was originally called Coaching for Performance by Sir John Whitmore, because he got his book title and context from a previous book called The Inner Game of Tennis. The Inner Game of Tennis. And that came out in 1974. So this is incredible that we see in the person who wrote The Inner Game of Tennis was also associated with this movement, because they realized that the Zen Buddhism principles could be applied to helping tennis players get a better game, helping tennis players clear what was in their minds, what was troubling them, so they could achieve that flow. And flow is another part of this that I'll talk about in another episode. So there is an interesting movement out of that original HPM, Human Potential Movement. It's an institute that's actually calling itself the Institutes for the Achievement of Human Potential. And it's internationally known, according to them, it's internationally known for its pioneering work in child brain development. Our goal for every brain-injured child is to have a fighting chance to be well. Our goal for every well child is to have the opportunity to be intellectually, physically, and socially excellent, so they are able to follow their own path to achieve their goals in life. And from what I can tell, I have not interacted with this organization, but my initial thoughts that I'm aligned with is that it was about helping children. It was about not leaving injured kids alone, and that these people had the capacity and resources to say that these kids could be quote unquote healed. And they made a general insight about humans that helped them persuade others why this work is important. And I quote that every child has genius potential. Stimulation is the key to unlocking a child's potential. Teaching should commence at birth. The younger the child, the easier the learning process. Children naturally love to learn. Parents are their child's best teacher. Teaching and learning should be joyous. Teaching and learning should never involve testing. That last point, that resonates a lot for me. And I haven't dived into the history of testing much, but as you and I can tell, all the great grades we got were very poor indicators of how actually we would do in the real world. But as far as I can tell, the people created these systems of testing were doing their best. There is that rigor that we admire about ourselves that we want to use for our science. The first chapter of Coaching for Performance, I admire Sir John Whitmore for saying, and I quote, "Roll on the day when the word coaching disappears from our lexicon altogether, and it just becomes the way we relate to one another at work and elsewhere too." This is what I'm hoping the show will do, such that coaching can happen at any time and you don't have to charge for it, and that it's about raising consciousness as these other individuals along Sir John Whitmore, Alan Watts, Ken Wilber, Patel, these guys are in me, I'm concerned about raising the consciousness of every person I interact with. And like you listening here, that is the point of the show. And here's another quote I like: "The attraction of telling or dictating is that, besides being quick and easy, it provides the dictator with the feeling of being in control. This is, however, a fallacy. The dictator upsets and demotivates his staff, but they dare not show it or offer feedback, which would not have been heard anyways." And this is time for me to talk about cults and how we use cults in jest. We joke about them. And there's been insidious cults, and tragic events have occurred through cults. And what comes to my mind is people get paid by the guru dictator to listen to him inside of a normal company where there is a dictator at the top. I'll say that again. People get paid by the guru to do what he wants. And this same dictator of this company expects a permanent stasis, as do the employees. So these are the people who say same shit, different day. SSDD, same shit, different day. It's not going to change. And then this malaise happens. It happened to me. I remember working at a store, Baskin Robbins, Best Buy, cleaning up dog poop. Me and the employees just had this mentality, and the manager, which was a cool guy, yet was just none of us. Yeah, the managers didn't try to coach us. We didn't try to coach each other. We didn't even know what coaching was. We didn't care. We showed up for our carrots then, our money. But I'm going to go back to the problem for a cult-like company, because I do believe that these companies are cults. You wear the same thing, except the guru at this company, the guru who is a dictator, they don't get to bang your wife. And that's my joke there. But the market changes for companies, and then the stasis that the dictator expected is no longer there. Things get disrupted. Sometimes the dictator actually doubles down. Then the employees, they allow it to happen. They get woefully blind or ignorant. Usually the best employees leave. Even if that does happen, though, some cults can stick around for years, these cult companies. So that doubling down occurs for a long time. So I think I'm going to start wrapping this up. And we've gotten through up some chapters, but definitely just scratched the surface of the book for Sir John Whitmore's Coaching for Performance. I want to go over this quote: "Coaching provides the manager with real, not illusory control, and provides the subordinate with real, not illusory responsibility." And this is what the show is about. I don't want to give you this sense that I have this fake control over you, or I have this fake control over people because I'm telling them what to do. It's because I'm giving you responsibility to do what you really want to do and to eliminate other activities and habits. That to me is what coaching is about right now, 2024. That when someone comes to me wanting to know what's going on in reality because there's something that they desire, but then they notice that their habits hold them down, or at the end of the day, they find it hard to calculate their wins and find their wins. That's when I know that I've been inserted into their life to raise their consciousness about what it is that they're doing, and evaluating that with the other activities they have in the day, the strategy they have for the future, the vision they have for the future. This show right now, as we're exploring the history of coaching, in some, for me, it is rooted in a consciousness of awareness, in a raising of vibrations. Now, that might put some people off when I mean vibrations. I haven't looked at the term for that, but we can relate that to a frequency that people are tuned into, which is like the positivity. And I'm also referencing right now David Hawkins' map of consciousness as a model, and models are incomplete. Yes, that's granted. But when I communicate things with you, with others, let's use models to help us understand a bit more, even if it's true but partial. Let's focus on the true part and use that. And it has worked for me. It has worked for my clients. So we talk about when a coaching moment happens, it is not a telling moment. It is not a teaching moment from one instructor to a student, not a one-way teaching. Instead, it's creating a pointing out such that the student sees what's getting pointed, because it didn't have to be the coach to do the pointing. It could have been an accident that happened. But the cool thing is that if I'm going to use the accident analogy, random accident, the coaching continuously brings up accidents, happy accidents in the way of our friend, I believe, well, our painter friend from that show. Gosh, his name escapes me. With the trees, that's what he called happy accidents, that painting show. Anyways, that's what this show is about. Why is coaching still prevalent? I can see how when people take the time to give attention to someone else, when a coach takes the time to give that attention, there is something magical that happens. And when I say magical, if I'm going to refine that, it's an increasing of consciousness on part of the coachee because of the questions that are being asked on part of the coach. Questions invite quests, and inner quests result in outer success. Yet it was the inner quest that determined the inner success. So, my friends, I'll be letting the show go on this note, and we'll be diving more into the history of coaching on the next one. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the other side. Thanks.